Ale is a research fellow on Swedish colonialism in the Caribbean, and he's explored questions of political rights, gender, race, and the legacy of colonialism in Swedish society. He graduated in 2016 from Stockholm University with a PhD thesis on political culture in the Swedish colony of St. Bartholomew in 1800 to 1825. He's since worked with archival digitization, GIS research, and other works on about the island. Annika completed her PhD also in Caribbean history, but in Oldenburg University in 2017. Since then, she's been taking a European tour, Oldenburg and Helsinki, and also working as a visiting assistant professor at Uppsala University and one of the founding members and researchers of the Prize Papers Digitization Project. Oh, this great crossover here. Okay, I don't. Maybe can we hear Annika? Was your microphone on? Yeah. Can you say that again?
Yeah, the Prize Papers collection is also represented and connected. So
wonderful. She's also worked on her own research projects on free Black women's pacotille trade in the Caribbean, and in this year, very recently, as she joined the ERC project, Slavery Abolition and Archipelagic Connections in the Swedish Caribbean at Uppsala University. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for having us here. I think this panel and discussion will marry quite well with the presentation on the Global Archives online and sort of talking a little bit about why we think those kind of archives are important. Yes. Within critical studies of colonial history, the archive is often seen as a nefarious object of power, reminiscent of a cursed tome in a fantasy book, a horror story, or a fairy tale. It can grant you great knowledge, but at a cost. Scholars who are interested in examining the conditions of marginalized people and peoples across the world have to contend with how the colonial administrative apparatus would bend and alter information about the colonized to fit its own imperial vision or its own system of knowledge. The colonial archive devoured those who did not want to be visible, and like in the tale of the Little Red Riding Hood, the hunter, that is the historian, has to somehow get them out of the stomach of the colonial wolf before being able to see them. Yet there are several ways to approach this process. Gayatri Spivak famously questioned the possibility of a subaltern voice and how such voices would be trapped between differing ideological visions of race and gender. Melissa Fuentes has criticized the way in which archival depictions of enslaved people reinforce their status as property rather than as human beings. One of the most prominent historians for our purpose is, however, Michel Rolf Troyot, who in his discussions on the history of the Haitian Revolution talked about active silencings of the archive. The first is a silencing of the creation of the archive, meaning what is it becomes documented, then the silencing of how the archive is sorted and maintained, then the silencing of what parts of the archive becomes narratives, and finally, which narrative seeps into the grand narrative, silencing the other parts. We will be referring to these as the first and to fourth silencings in this talk. As scholars involved in Caribbean and digital history, this perspective holds fundamental and important truths, but can quite easily give way to a fatalistic view of the archive as a doomed institution, or an institution which has to be mistrusted and fought against. The question, which always must be asked of any scholar which is critical towards archival institutions, such as we are, is, have you been to the archive? This is not meant to patronize or to dismiss critical views of the archive or archival sources, but that such can only be understood in direct communication of them as a tool in dialogue with the actual archival documents. After all, archival work has to be understood as a material process. This involves travel, funding, lunch breaks, back pain, and administration. It is not a coincidence that it is the global and colonial archives that has often been the victims of such difficulties. In this way, historical inquiry has often been hemmed in by archival practicality. And it was so even more so, but for only a few decades past. The technological advancements of digital photography, which was not a possibility as early as 30 years ago, now allows us to go deeper into marginalized archives, which are often chaotic and hard to reach. Here, the benefit of digitalization and digital tools is largely not to automate the process of reading archival documentation, but to make the step towards exploring the archive as small as possible. Another reason why this previous platform is very important. After all, one of the central premises of many of the critical perspectives towards colonial archives is that they hold few, if any, documents in which marginalized people speak. We are not saying that this is universally incorrect, but it is far from universally correct. This is where digitalization provides a key. When digitalization is done right, it can grant access to a large amount of documentation, allowing the historian to approach and extract the voices they are looking for. However, that means that already the step of digitization requires a decolonization effort. The digitizer handling the historical data must be aware of the colonial past of the archive. They need to keep the threshold for finding silenced people low by, meaning creating explicit search categories and registering the documents they enter accordingly. Any digital archive can only be as decolonial as the people creating it. After all, to come back to our historiographic version of the Little Red Riding Hood, the girl and her grandmother, while eaten, are still all there. They're simply hidden in the wolf's archival stomach. In the Grimm brothers' fairy tale, the wolf is sleeping happily after having devoured the two women, and the hunter has to cut open his stomach. While creating digital decolonized archives, it is our task to reform the wolf, so that when the hunter comes in, our wolf welcomes them, asks them whether they would maybe like to study Red Riding Hood and a grandmother, and then helpfully spit them out in pristine condition. After that, it is up to the hunter how they handle what they see. In our work, we are in the particular position of being both the archival wolf and historian hunter. While curating and creating digital archives of the Caribbean past ourselves, we also rely on them in our study of one of the most effectively silenced groups of people in Western historiography, free Black women and women of color.
Exactly, and these paintings which you're going to see are in themselves an act of silencing, and they're extremely embellished depiction of Caribbean life. But free women of color as a colonial category were positioned between enslaved and white women, and this category had practically existed as long as slavery had. While previous narratives have mostly portrayed free women of color as dependent on prostitution and small-scale commerce for survival, recent studies have increasingly highlighted their diversity in terms of class, but also profession, status, and social presence within colonial society. Christine Walker's book Jamaica Ladies stands out here, but also the work of Caribbean scholars such as Abel Alexis Louis or Melanie Newton. And most importantly, our work with digitalized archives has demonstrated that the documents displaying the voices of free women of color are actually out, or rather in, there. The most fundamental advantage of digital archives, namely that they allow us to extremely quickly access large volumes of historical data across vast geographical distances, proves itself again here. The documents we study are spread out across Stockholm, London, the south of France, as well as the former Swedish and French colonial outposts of Saint-Barthélemy, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. All of these archives hold impressive amounts of historical testimonies of free Black women, and not just of victimhood and oppression, but also stories in which free Black women show up as agents, as mistresses of their own lives, as members of families and networks, as persons with a sense of honor and selfhood, and also a sense of humor. In the digitized French colonial archives, we meet the free women of color Ursule and Rose, who lived together in St. Lucia in the 1760s. Ursule, who was a successful tradeswoman who traveled between the several Caribbean colonies and across lines of empire, passed away in 1769, and then Rose, her friend and roommate, took over her business in collaboration with the colonial authorities. And this collaboration was detailed in long protocols by the French colonial administration. And while exclusively white and institutional in their authorships, these documents nevertheless managed to show two women of color who lived self-governed and quite successful lives and managed their legal affairs with much competence and knowledge, and who were loyal friends even until death, into their death, into their demise, and protected each other's business affairs, but also each other's, in a way, each other's legacies. And in the growing prize papers archives, which I've and collection, which I've already mentioned, users will, amongst many other things referring to the lives of free black women in the Caribbean, find documents written by free women of color themselves. For example, a letter written by a woman called Claudine Gouard. She wrote her letter in the midst of the French Revolution. She found herself in Bordeaux in 1793. So at the beginning of the Terror, and she wrote to her mother, a free black woman called Julie Chatelard, and her mother lived in Saint-Domingue at the time, also very shaken up by the revolution that should in the end lead to its becoming Haiti. So these women are really in one of the, with hindsight, most turbulent times of our recent European, at least, and Atlantic histories. And Claudine's letter is full of exactly that. She describes the events, and her letter is full of worry. It's full of inquiry about her family, her mother's well-being. How is everybody doing? And she tries to send money and goods to help the family. And the possibilities granted here by digital archives allow us to put into perspective historiographic narratives of fragmented and inconsistent and black families in slave societies. And they show, in many examples, very stable relationships over long periods of time, over great geographical distances, where black families show up as stable and consistent and very loving. And then there is our collection. There is the collection, the Swedish Caribbean collection, which holds a rather impressive small sort of sub-collection of free women of color's petitions to the colonial court of the Swedish Caribbean colony of Saint Barthélemy. And that is particularly impressive when it comes to not only statements of self, but really demands of acknowledging selfhood and agency made by free women of color. There's, for example, the case of Marie-Louise Langlois, a case which I like a lot, who in 1819 asked the court for legal recourse against a man by the name of Pitre Chamy. The latter, so she described in her petition, had come to the door of her dwelling in the town of Gustavia and without any provocation started to abuse her. She was particularly offended by him accusing her of buying an evil charm from an enslaved man, which he then said she was going to use on the daughter of a woman she knew, so this daughter could not marry a young man, which Marie-Louise Langlois also knew. It's very convoluted. But she was extremely incensed by this and asked the court to help and, quote, she wanted to see him condemned. And this petition is quite exceptional as a testimonial because it shows, on the one hand, a really very early modern court system, a Swedish court, which is very much informed by Swedish court practices, but as the place to settle incredibly Caribbean matters. It's like poisoning and buying charms and poisoning people and preventing marriages. It doesn't get more stereotypical Caribbean than that. And we have here a case of a free woman of color defending her honor in a Caribbean colony and in the where really worlds collide in a way.
Yeah. One of the more difficult questions that Caribbeanists and historians of slavery today grapple with are the ways in which free people, including free women of color, participated in the system of slavery. Since the ideological justifications of chattel slavery was fundamentally connected to perceptions of race and blackness, free people of color existed in a liminal space of having the legal right to participate as enforcers of slavery and owners of enslaved people, while almost always having familial or personal ties to the victims of such enforcement. If we are to understand the contradictions of this status, actually engaging with the voices of free people of color is key here. In 1820, free woman of color Jane Brossette sent a petition to the colonial court. Another free woman of color, Anne Cusack, who lived in Saint-Martin, it's not clear if it was the Dutch or the French Saint-Martin, but it's not important. Anne Cusack owed her $95, and thus Brossette announced that she intended to have her debt repaid, and she did so by sending a letter to the British Caribbean, which also shows how interconnected all these islands were. In order to be repaid, she asked the court to arrest and sell the enslaved man Benjamin, which was the property of Anne Cusack, via a public auction. So this is one of the ways in which free women of color would engage in the system. In another case from 1812, free woman of color Ross wanted to sell the slave Félicité into freedom instead. Félicité had been a gift to her daughter from the Swedish administrator Anders Bergstedt, and we can see here how enslaved people could have a status as a commodity as well as personal relations for free women of color, as well as how the colonial law could both enforce the commodification of enslaved individuals while also being one of the necessary parts for such enslaved people on their path to freedom. Not the only path, of course.
And we're gonna make this even more complicated. This is a case from Saint-Domingue from 1777. It's a parish register. So what you see here is a marriage being recorded, and it's a marriage between a woman called Françoise Alexis, a free black woman, and she marries a man called Louis, who is a mason. And Louis is enslaved, and he belongs to Françoise Alexis. So Françoise Alexis marries a man she technically legally owns. And to those who work with or on early modern legal hierarchies or gender relations, this is, by early modern standards, this is completely wild. Reversing, this is the most drastic, probably one of the most drastic upheavals of power in a two-person relationship you can have in the early modern period, when you go from a woman legally owning a man to a man not only directly becoming free, but technically this woman's legal protector, as they liked to call it. So it is, but this is also how we find free black women in you can't say engaging with slavery, but handling relationships in the context of slavery.
Yeah.
Wrap it up.
All right. We could go on. There was another example, but I'm going to skip it due to time. I'll ask it if it's... But through these examples, we can see a wide range of aspects concerning the slaveholding patterns of free women of color and their relations towards the enslaved. And with this material, the digitized, reformed archival wolf has well and truly spit it out. The historian hunter has the voices they're looking for at hand, still distorted by colonial contexts and documentation, but nevertheless clearly audible. What do you do now? To come back to Troyot and the silencings, with the first and second silencing hopefully somewhat mitigated by the careful curation of these digital archives, how do we avoid the third and fourth silencing by not sticking to unhelpful narratives that might hide the very people we wish to bring forth into the spotlight?
We believe that digital history can make a critical intervention by highlighting the documents thought to be lost in the second silencing, the archival selection, and if done correctly, and there's no saying that we are currently doing it correctly, we're just trying, it can create a cascading effect where more scholars will be interested in selecting these archival sources, counteracting the third silencing, where more easily accessible archives are prioritized, and hopefully work to undermine the fourth silencing, where these narratives are excluded from larger grand narratives. For example, now we can see that free women of color were actively part of their communities, participating in economic, social, and legal processes. Yet we have to be observant on how their presence is communicated and portrayed within historical narratives. After all, as participants in colonial societies, they were active in colonial processes, at times through resistance and amelioration, but not always, and honestly, is it even fair to put such very modern expectations on them? We believe that it is not. Inside the wolf's stomach, these voices in all their variety are indeed silenced, but once they emerge, we have to contend with what they say, and not what we thought they must have said before we heard them. In this way, digitalization is a great resource, but also a challenge for us all colonial historians. Thank you.